I was trapped inside my own body listening to the rhythmic beeping of my life support machine when my own sister signed my death warrant. The doctor explicitly told her I still had brain activity and a real chance at recovery, but she coldly insisted it was time to let me go. She wanted my assets more than she wanted me alive. Just minutes before they were scheduled to pull the plug, my eyes snapped open. I grabbed the doctor by his collar and whispered one sentence that made the blood drain completely from his face. "My name is Nia and I am 32 years old. Before I tell you exactly what I said to that doctor, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever survived a betrayal by the very people who were supposed to protect you, hit the like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear every single detail of how I took back my life and dismantled my toxic family. To the outside world, I was just a tragic victim of a devastating car crash. But in the cold, sterile room of the intensive care unit, my mind was wide awake. I was locked in a state of paralysis, unable to move a muscle or open my eyes, but my hearing was crystal clear. I could smell the sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and hear the squeak of rubber soles on the linoleum floor. Most importantly, I could hear the hushed conversation happening right at the foot of my hospital bed. Dr. Harrison, a man whose calm voice I had come to recognize over the past week, was trying desperately to reason with my older sister Simone. He was explaining that my latest neurological scans showed promising signs of activity. He said Nia is fighting Simone. We need to give her more time. The swelling in her brain is going down and her vitals are finally stabilizing. But Simone was not having it. My sister, the golden child of our family, the woman who had spent her entire life trying to outshine me, let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was the exact same fake sigh she used at Sunday service when she wanted the congregation to think she was carrying a heavy spiritual burden. She told the doctor with a perfectly manufactured tremble in her voice that it was cruel to keep me living this way. She claimed I would never want to exist as a burden to my family and that it was time to make the hard choice and let God take over. I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and rip the intravenous tubes out of my arms. A burden. That word echoed in my mind. That was rich, coming from her. I had spent the last decade working myself into the ground to build a highly successful luxury boutique hotel chain in Atlanta from scratch. Meanwhile, she played the role of a wealthy socialite with her investment broker husband Bradley. I was the one quietly paying off their debts and maintaining their lifestyle, and now she was playing the grieving sister, ready to cash in on my tragedy. I heard the rustle of thick paperwork. Dr. Harrison hesitated. He told her that as my legal next of kin, she had the right to make the final call, but he strongly advised against withdrawing care so soon. Simone did not even pause to think about it. I heard the sharp, distinct scratch of a pen against paper. She was signing the medical consent forms to withdraw life support. She was officially pulling the plug on her own sister. She calmly instructed the doctor to give the family a few hours to gather and say their final goodbyes before turning off the machines. Then I heard her designer heels clicking out of the room as fast as she could walk. She did not even bother to touch my hand or say goodbye. The moment the heavy hospital door clicked shut, sheer panic flooded my veins. Adrenaline pumped through my system. I had to wake up. I channeled every single ounce of willpower I possessed, focusing entirely on my right hand. The machines surrounding me began to beep faster and louder, sensing the sudden spike in my heart rate and internal struggle. Dr. Harrison quickly walked over to check my monitors. As he leaned in close to adjust a wire on my chest, my eyelids fluttered violently and finally snapped open. The bright fluorescent lights blinded me for a second, but I pushed through the searing pain. Before he could even call out in shock, I raised my heavy right hand and tightly grabbed the fabric of his blue scrubs. I pulled him down toward my face. My throat felt like sandpaper from the breathing tube they had recently removed, but I forced the words out clear, steady, and filled with absolute venom. I told him to hold on to those papers she just signed, because that is concrete proof of attempted murder. Dr. Harrison froze, completely paralyzed by my grip and my words. I took another painful breath, refusing to let go of his shirt, and kept going. I told him I transferred my medical power of attorney to my private lawyer last week. She has absolutely no legal right to touch my machines or make decisions for me. And doctor, you need to run a full toxicology screen on my blood right now, because the toxin in my system was injected by her white husband Bradley just hours before my car crashed. The doctor stared at me in absolute horror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the hospital sheets I was lying on. He looked down at the signed withdrawal forms trembling in his hand, and then back into my wide-awake eyes, finally realizing that the grieving sister act he just witnessed was a meticulously planned cover for a cold-blooded execution. Dr. Harrison stumbled backward and slammed his hand onto the emergency call button on the wall. The intercom crackled loudly as he frantically demanded hospital security report to the intensive care unit immediately. But before the dispatcher could even confirm his request, the heavy double doors swung open. Simone burst into the room with her face buried in her hands, producing loud, dramatic sobs that echoed off the sterile walls. Bradley was right behind her, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and carrying a steaming cup of expensive artisan coffee. He looked like he was ready to close a corporate merger rather than attend a bedside vigil. They were putting on an award-winning theatrical performance of the grieving family, returning to say their final tearful goodbyes to a dying sister. Then Simone lowered her hands to peek at the bed. Her fake cries died instantly in her throat. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. The ceramic coffee cup slipped right through his fingers and shattered loudly against the linoleum floor, sending hot brown liquid splashing across his polished leather shoes. For a split second, the carefully crafted masks slipped completely off their faces. I saw pure, unadulterated panic flash in Bradley's eyes. He knew exactly what he had slipped into my intravenous bag before the car crash, and he knew I was not supposed to be breathing, let alone staring right back at him with absolute clarity. But Bradley did not become a ruthless millionaire investment broker by freezing under pressure. Within seconds, his shock morphed into an aggressive, commanding authority. He stepped right over the spilled coffee and marched straight up to Dr. Harrison, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence. He did not ask what was going on or check on my condition. He immediately dictated the narrative. He pointed a stiff finger at my face and told the doctor that my sudden awakening was clearly a frantic post-traumatic brain spasm. He confidently used medical jargon he had probably researched to cover his tracks, claiming I was experiencing severe paranoia and violent hallucinations as a result of my massive head trauma. Dr. Harrison tried to stand his ground. He raised his hands defensively and stated that I was highly lucid and had just made very serious criminal allegations regarding my medical power of attorney and poisoning. That was the exact moment Bradley weaponized his privilege. He stepped uncomfortably close to the doctor, towering over him and pushing him back toward the medical monitors. He lowered his voice into a dangerous, threatening register that demanded absolute submission. He calmly reminded Dr. Harrison that his investment firm had just brokered a $2 million donation to the new pediatric wing of this very hospital. He threatened to call the hospital board of directors right that second and have the doctor stripped of his medical license for indulging the wild delusions of a severely brain-damaged patient instead of administering proper sedative care. He demanded I be heavily medicated immediately to prevent further psychological trauma to my fragile brain. Simone saw the doctor hesitate under the weight of her husband's financial threats, and she instantly took her cue. She marched to the side of my bed, her face twisted with a vicious, ugly rage that only I was positioned to see. She leaned down so her face was mere inches from mine. I could smell her expensive floral perfume mixed with the bitter, metallic scent of her deep-rooted jealousy. She raised her manicured hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek echoed like a gunshot through the quiet room. My skin burned instantly, but I refused to flinch. I just stared into her dark eyes, reading the absolute hatred she held for me. Simone quickly spun around to face the shocked doctor, acting like a deeply distressed sister who had simply reached her breaking point. She cried out that I was completely out of my mind and causing a scene that was embarrassing the entire family in our darkest hour. She yelled that I was always selfish, always trying to ruin everything, and now I was making my own tragic accident all about my desperate need for attention. She begged Dr. Harrison to sedate me before I hurt myself or caused my own heart to give out from the hysteria. I felt the stinging heat on my cheek and the heavy, agonizing fatigue pulling at my broken limbs. The heart monitor beside me began to beep rapidly, betraying my rising panic and giving them exactly the medical excuse they needed to drug me into oblivion. I realized in that terrifying claustrophobic moment that I was completely outmatched. I was physically broken, strapped to a hospital bed, and surrounded by two ruthless predators who had the immense wealth and the societal privilege to make any hospital administrator believe their lies over the word of an injured black woman. If I kept fighting them right then and there, Bradley would ensure I was pumped full of antipsychotics, and they would eventually find a way to finish the job under the unassailable guise of medical intervention. So I made the hardest choice I have ever had to make in my entire life. I swallowed my pride and I stopped fighting. I let the monitor beep frantically for a few more seconds to sell the illusion of a failing body, and then I intentionally relaxed every single muscle. I let my eyes roll back slightly before letting my heavy eyelids flutter shut. I went completely limp against the stiff mattress, mimicking a sudden loss of consciousness. The monitors gradually slowed down to a steady rhythmic pace. I heard Dr. Harrison push Bradley aside to urgently check my pulse, calling nervously for a nurse to prepare a mild sedative just to stabilize my vitals. I lay there in the artificial darkness listening to my sister and her husband exhale in relief, thinking they had won the battle. I was trapped in the dark again, but this time I was no longer a helpless victim. I was a predator playing dead, safely hidden in the shadows, waiting patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. The heavy wooden door to my intensive care room flew open, hitting the wall with a loud thud that made the medical equipment rattle. Even with my eyes firmly shut, maintaining my charade of deep unconsciousness, I instantly recognized the overwhelming presence that had just entered. The sterile smell of the hospital was immediately masked by the heavy, suffocating scent of gardenia perfume mixed with the lingering aroma of church incense. Mama Joyce had arrived. She did not simply walk into a room, she announced her presence like a grand marshal at a parade, demanding that all attention shift entirely to her. I lay perfectly still, trapped in the artificial darkness behind my eyelids. A tiny, pathetic part of my heart, the part of me that was still a little girl seeking her mother's approval, waited for the frantic rush of footsteps to the side of my bed. I braced myself for the warmth of her hand grabbing mine. I waited for her to desperately ask the doctor if her youngest daughter was going to survive the night. Instead, the sharp, aggressive clacking of her sensible church heels bypassed my bed entirely. I heard the loud rustle of her stiff taffeta dress as she rushed straight past me and right into the waiting arms of my sister. Simone immediately dialed her theatrical performance up to the absolute maximum. She let out a loud, shaking gasp and collapsed against our mother, burying her face in Mama Joyce's shoulder. Simone began hyperventilating on command, sobbing about how deeply traumatizing it was to watch me thrash around in a medically induced nightmare. She cried that she could not bear to see me suffering, and that she was only trying to do what was best for my soul. Mama Joyce did not question a single word. She immediately began shushing Simone, stroking her hair, and speaking in that soft, sickeningly sweet tone she reserved exclusively for her golden child. She told Simone to hush now and wipe her tears. She praised Simone for being so incredibly brave and strong, carrying the heavy burden of this family tragedy on her delicate shoulders. Then my mother finally turned her attention toward my bed, but she did not speak with the profound relief of a parent whose child had miraculously awakened from a coma. She spoke with pure, unadulterated annoyance. She stood right at the foot of my bed and began loudly lecturing my supposedly unconscious body, as if I had intentionally orchestrated this entire car crash just to inconvenience her schedule. She complained bitterly that my little medical stunt had completely ruined her Woman of the Year honors ceremony at the First Baptist Church. She ranted about how she had been waiting 10 long years for Pastor Jenkins to present her with that engraved crystal plaque in front of the entire congregation. She had spent $500 on a custom imported hat just for the occasion. And right as the choir was finishing their hymn and they were calling her name to approach the altar, Bradley had to call and say, "I was throwing a violent tantrum in the intensive care unit." I listened to her voice echo off the cold walls, feeling a hollow emptiness expand in my chest. My mother was standing inches away from a daughter she was told might never wake up again, and her biggest grievance was a missed photo opportunity at church. But her twisted vanity was not even the worst part. Mama Joyce took a deep breath and continued her tirade, letting slip a piece of information that made my blood run absolutely cold. She crossed her arms and loudly huffed, telling my silent body that I always had to make everything about me. She said that while I was lying here resting comfortably in a luxury hospital bed, my sister was working herself to the bone, trying to clean up my financial messes. Then my mother proudly announced that Simone had even gone through the agonizing trouble of contacting my lawyers yesterday to transfer the deed of my Aspen cabin entirely into her own name. Mama Joyce praised Simone for taking the initiative to liquidate my real estate, just to ensure these outrageous hospital bills would be covered so that the family would not be publicly embarrassed by debt. She scolded me for putting so much unwarranted stress on Simone and Bradley, claiming they were sacrificing their own happiness to manage my estate. The Aspen cabin. The word slammed into my brain like a physical blow. That cabin was my ultimate sanctuary. It was a massive, beautiful property nestled in the mountains that I had purchased entirely in cash after the wildly successful launch of my very first boutique hotel. It was my proudest achievement, and the one place I went to escape the suffocating demands of this exact family. And Simone had stolen it. She had used the emergency medical power of attorney they forced me to sign before my surgery to quietly transfer my multi-million-dollar real estate directly into her own name under the absolute lie of paying my medical bills. But they did not need a single dime for my hospital care. I had premium platinum health insurance that covered absolutely every single expense down to the very last bandage. They were not trying to save the family from debt. They were systematically bleeding me dry and carving up my assets while my heart was still beating. I heard Bradley step forward, playing his role flawlessly. He placed a gentle hand on my mother's shoulder and used his smooth, persuasive broker voice. He told Mama Joyce that she did not need to worry about a thing because he was handling all the complex legal paperwork to spare the family any further pain. He humbly claimed he was just doing what any good devoted husband would do to support his wife through a devastating family tragedy. Mama Joyce practically melted at his words. She reached up and patted his hand, thanking him for being such a strong, capable provider. She loudly proclaimed that Simone was truly blessed to have found a man of such high caliber, unlike the men I usually associated with. The sheer audacity of his performance, combined with my mother's blind, absolute devotion to him, made me want to vomit. He was the man who had injected me with a lethal muscle relaxant to ensure my car would swerve off the highway, and my mother was praising him as the savior of our family. I lay there listening to the three of them bond over my impending demise. The nurse finally returned to the room, her rubber shoes squeaking against the floor. She quietly administered the mild sedative Dr. Harrison had ordered into my intravenous line. As the cool liquid entered my bloodstream, a heavy artificial lethargy began to pull my mind down into a genuine sleep. But before the darkness fully consumed me, a profound, unbreakable resolve crystallized in my spirit. I finally accepted the devastating truth I had spent my entire life trying to ignore. These people were not my family. They were parasites. They were highly organized predators hiding behind church hats and tailored suits. And as the sedative dragged me under, I made a silent vow that when I finally woke up, I would not just take back my cabin and my company. I was going to burn their entire fraudulent world straight to the ground and watch them fight over the ashes. Hours passed in a heavy chemical haze before the sedative finally began to wear off. The bustling daytime noises of the intensive care unit faded into the eerie silence of the midnight shift. The only sounds left were the slow, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the steady beeps of the monitors keeping me company in the dark. I was floating in that strange twilight between sleep and wakefulness when the door to my room slowly clicked open. It was not the brisk, confident stride of a night nurse doing rounds. These footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and cautious. I kept my breathing perfectly even and my eyes firmly shut. A shadow fell over my face, blocking out the dim hallway light. I could smell the sharp, expensive bite of aged scotch mixed with the faint odor of stale cigar smoke. Bradley had returned, and this time he was completely alone. He stood beside my bed in total silence for what felt like an eternity, just watching me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Then he leaned in uncomfortably close. His face hovered mere inches from my ear. I could feel his warm, alcohol-laced breath brushing against my skin as he finally spoke. His voice was a low, arrogant whisper completely stripped of the fake concern he had performed for the doctor and my mother. He chuckled, a dark, cruel sound that made my stomach turn. He whispered how tragic it was to see the great Nia reduced to this. He mocked me, calling me the fierce, independent businesswoman who thought she was invincible, now lying here completely helpless. He said it was almost poetic that all my hard work and endless hustle were finally going to benefit the people who actually deserved it. He told me I had always been entirely too arrogant for my own good, always parading my success around the family like a trophy while looking down on him and Simone. I focused every ounce of my willpower on keeping my heart rate completely steady on the monitor. If I spiked now, he would know I was awake. I lay there paralyzed by necessity as he continued his twisted midnight confession. Bradley leaned even closer, his voice dripping with venom and desperate pride. He said he was going to tell me a little secret since I was taking it to the grave anyway. He confessed that his perfect investment firm, the one my mother practically worshipped, was completely underwater. He had made a series of catastrophic unauthorized trades over the past 2 years trying to double his money. Instead, he lost everything. But he did not just lose his own money. He told me he was currently $10 million in debt to a ruthless private venture capital fund. These were not the kind of people who sent polite collection notices. These were men who would absolutely destroy his life, his reputation, and potentially his physical safety if he did not pay them back by the end of the month. He let out a shaky breath, betraying the sheer terror hiding beneath his arrogant smirk. But then his voice smoothed out, returning to that smug, sickening confidence. He told me I was his absolute salvation. My car crash was the miracle he had been praying for. He explained exactly how he was going to dismantle my life's work. My boutique hotel chain was currently valued at $15 million. He knew this because he had been secretly tracking my financials through a contact at my bank for months. He whispered that while I was unconscious, he had already initiated a hostile takeover of my assets using the emergency medical power of attorney Simone had tricked the hospital into accepting. But he knew a simple medical proxy was not enough to legally liquidate a corporate entity. So he laid out his masterstroke. He gleefully confessed that he had found a massive legal loophole in my corporate structure. He had hired a corrupt notary public, paying him $50,000 under the table to backdate a series of forged transfer documents. These documents claim that months before my accident, I had signed over the controlling shares of my hotel chain to a shell company Bradley secretly controlled. He told me the paperwork was airtight. By the time I took my last breath, his shell company would officially absorb my $15 million empire. He would sell off my hotels, pay off his $10 million debt to the venture capital fund, and keep the remaining $5 million to fund his lavish lifestyle with my sister. He actually laughed. He patted my cheek with a heavy, condescending hand. He thanked me for being such a hard worker and building such a lucrative portfolio for him to inherit. He whispered that Simone did not even know the full extent of his financial ruin or his intricate plan to steal the hotels. She just thought they were securing the family legacy. He called her beautifully naive and easily manipulated, just like my mother. He boasted that he was the only one in the family smart enough to pull off a move this brilliant. He stood up straight, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He looked down at me one last time and coldly whispered, "Goodbye, Nia. Sleep well, knowing your empire is in much better hands." Then he turned and walked out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The moment I was completely alone, the sheer magnitude of his confession washed over me. Bradley was not just a greedy brother-in-law looking for a quick payout. He was a desperate, cornered animal willing to commit massive corporate fraud, forgery, and murder to save his own skin. He thought he was a mastermind playing a flawless game of chess against an opponent who was already dead. He thought I was permanently trapped in the dark. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the exact blueprint of his own destruction. He had explicitly named the forged documents, the bribed notary, and the $10 million debt to the venture capital fund. He had given me every single piece of the puzzle I needed to completely annihilate him. My blood was boiling with a rage so pure and focused it felt like ice in my veins. The sedative was completely gone now, replaced by a burning adrenaline. I slowly opened my eyes, staring up at the dark ceiling of the hospital room. I did not just want to survive anymore. I wanted to watch Bradley lose everything he had ever valued. I wanted him to feel the exact same helplessness he thought he had forced upon me. I lay there in the quiet darkness, meticulously planning my next move, knowing exactly what I had to do the second the sun came up. The heavy hospital door clicked shut, and the faint sound of Bradley's expensive leather shoes echoed down the hallway until there was nothing left but silence. For a long moment I simply stared at the ceiling, letting the sheer magnitude of his arrogance wash over me. My right hand, which had been resting flat against the crisp white sheets, slowly curled into a tight fist. My nails dug so fiercely into my palm that it almost drew blood. I was no longer a victim trapped in a broken body. I was a woman holding the exact coordinates of my enemy's destruction. A soft scratching sound at the door pulled me from my thoughts. The handle turned with agonizing slowness. I froze, keeping my breathing shallow, just in case Bradley had decided to return for an encore. But instead of a tailored suit, a familiar pair of maroon hospital scrubs slipped through the narrow opening. It was Clara, the head nurse of the intensive care unit. Clara was not just a nurse. She was my line sister from our days at Spelman College. We had crossed the burning sands together over a decade ago, and that bond was something thicker than blood. When they first brought me into this hospital broken and bleeding, Clara was the one who noticed my vitals spiking whenever my family entered the room. She was the one who leaned in close during a midnight shift and whispered to me to squeeze her hand if I could hear her. She was my only ally in a building full of people my family had successfully manipulated. Clara quickly checked the hallway and pushed the heavy door completely shut, engaging the manual deadbolt. She rushed over to my bed, her dark eyes scanning my face with intense concern. She leaned down and asked me in a hushed whisper if he had hurt me. I slowly shook my head. My throat was still raw, but my voice was much stronger now, fueled by pure adrenaline. I told her he did not lay a finger on me because he thought I was already dead. I shifted my weight, ignoring the sharp ache in my ribs, and reached my hand beneath my thin hospital pillow. My fingers brushed against a small, hard rectangular object. I pulled it out into the dim light. It was a high-grade digital micro-recorder. Clara had smuggled it into my room 2 days ago, hidden inside a box of sterile gauze. She knew my family was acting suspiciously, and she wanted me to have a way to protect myself when she was not on shift. The moment I had smelled the sharp bite of Bradley's scotch, I had blindly reached under the pillow and pressed the record button. I held the tiny device out to Clara. I told her we got him. I told her he confessed to absolutely everything, from the forged documents to the massive debt he owes a private venture capital fund. Clara's eyes widened. She quickly pulled a sleek encrypted tablet from her oversized scrub pocket. She took the recorder from my trembling hand and connected it to the tablet using a small adapter cable. The screen illuminated her face in a soft blue glow as she accessed the audio files. She tapped the screen, and Bradley's smug, arrogant voice filled the quiet hospital room. We listened to the crisp, clear playback of his midnight confession. We heard him brag about the bribed notary and his grand plan to absorb my $15 million hotel chain. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes burning with fierce protective anger. When the recording finished, she looked at me and asked if we should call the police right this second. She said we had enough to put him away for attempted murder and fraud. I shook my head firmly. I told her no. I explained that Bradley was a wealthy, connected white man in Atlanta with a team of expensive corporate defense attorneys on retainer. If we handed this recording to the local police right now, his lawyers would tie it up in court for years. They would argue the audio was obtained illegally in a private medical facility. They would claim he was just venting his financial stress to a comatose relative and never actually intended to act on it. I told Clara I refused to let him slip through the cracks of the justice system with a slap on the wrist. I needed him to execute his plan completely. Clara looked confused for a second before a slow, sharp smile spread across her face. She realized exactly what I was doing. I told her I needed him to take those forged documents and officially file them with the federal bank. The moment he uses fraudulent paperwork to secure capital or transfer assets across state lines, it instantly becomes a federal crime. I did not want him dealing with local detectives. I wanted him facing the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But to make that happen, I had to stay dead to the world just a little bit longer. Clara nodded in absolute agreement. Her fingers flew across the tablet screen. She rapidly uploaded the audio file to a secure offshore cloud server that my tech team had built for my corporate data. Once the upload reached 100%, she wiped the micro-recorder completely clean and slipped it back into her pocket. The evidence was now untouchable, backed up on servers Bradley could never reach. Then Clara pulled up my official medical chart. She looked at me with a deadly serious expression and told me she was going to alter my daily progress reports. She would officially document my condition as minimally responsive with severe cognitive delays. This would keep Dr. Harrison from rushing my recovery process, and it would give my family the false confidence they needed to move forward with their hostile takeover. I thanked her, telling her I owed her my life. She gently squeezed my hand and replied that sisterhood meant showing up when it actually mattered, unlike the people sharing my DNA. Before Clara unlocked the door to resume her rounds, I gave her one final crucial task. I recited a private, unlisted phone number from memory. I told her she needed to call that number at dawn and ask for a woman named Evelyn. Evelyn was my real attorney, the one who managed my private, irrevocable trusts, the assets my family had absolutely no idea existed. I instructed Clara to tell Evelyn that the contingency plan was officially active and to prepare the federal bear trap. As Clara slipped out of the room, quietly locking the door behind her, I settled back into the hospital pillows. The physical pain in my body was entirely overshadowed by the brilliant clarity of my mission. Bradley thought he had found a legal loophole to steal my empire. He had no idea he was about to step into a financial minefield I had designed years ago, just in case my toxic family ever tried to cross the line. The game was officially on. The next 2 weeks were an absolute masterclass in deception. When the sun was up, I was the perfect broken victim. I stared blankly at the beige hospital walls, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. When Dr. Harrison visited during his morning rounds and asked me simple questions like what day it was or if I knew my own name, I would slowly blink and stammer out confused, fragmented syllables. I watched the profound pity pool in his eyes as he documented my severe cognitive delays, exactly as Clara had strategically suggested he do in my chart. But the real performance, the one that required every ounce of my self-control, was for my family. Mama Joyce visited every other afternoon, loudly complaining about the exorbitant price of hospital parking and how the cafeteria food was aggravating her blood pressure. She would stand at the foot of my bed, talking about me as if I was already a ghost. She would put her church friends on speakerphone, loudly declaring that the Lord was testing her faith by burdening her with a daughter who had permanent brain damage. Simone would sit in the vinyl guest chair in the corner, filing her nails and sighing heavily, checking her designer watch every 5 minutes. She did not even bother to fake cry anymore now that she firmly believed my mind was permanently erased. And Bradley was a sight to behold. He practically floated into my hospital room, smelling of expensive imported cologne and misplaced victory. He would stand by my side and speak in a sickeningly sweet voice whenever the nurses were present, but the moment the door clicked shut, his mask vanished. He would softly pat my hand and arrogant whisper updates about his hostile takeover. He told me the backdated notary documents had just cleared the first major hurdle at the state registry. He was so blindingly arrogant, so deeply convinced of his own superior intellect, that he never noticed the absolute deadly focus in my eyes when he turned his back. The moment visiting hours ended and the overhead lights dimmed, the quiet hospital ward became my war room. Clara would quietly slip into my room during her graveyard shift, carrying a sleek silver laptop hidden seamlessly under a stack of fresh thermal blankets. She would pull the privacy curtain tight, lock the heavy door, and hand me the machine. I completely ignored the throbbing pain in my fractured ribs and the heavy cast binding my left leg. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a cold, calculating rage that burned hotter than any fever. My first move was contacting Evelyn. She was not just my attorney, she was a ruthless legal shark in a tailored suit who managed the complex web of my private finances. I sent her a fully encrypted message using the secure offshore server Clara and I had established. I told her the absolute worst-case scenario contingency protocols were now active, and I needed a completely untraceable phone call at exactly 2 in the morning. When the time came, Clara handed me an untraceable burner phone. Evelyn answered on the very first ring. I kept my voice to a sharp, raspy whisper detailing every single thing Bradley had confessed to in the dark. I told her about his $10 million debt to the ruthless venture capital fund, the corrupt bribed notary, and his grand plan to legally absorb my $15 million boutique hotel chain into a shell company he controlled. Evelyn did not panic. Instead, she laughed, a low, dangerous sound that echoed smoothly through the phone receiver. She reminded me of the brilliant financial failsafe we had built into my corporate structure 3 years ago, just in case my greedy family ever tried to cross the line. On paper, public state records showed a holding company carrying my name. But that company was a total ghost. It was a dummy corporation holding 0 actual capital and 0 real estate. My real empire, the luxury hotels, the prime real estate deeds, the massive cash reserves, was securely locked away inside an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust that I did not even technically own on paper. I instructed Evelyn to let Bradley take the bait. We were not going to stop him from filing those forged documents. In fact, we were going to silently grease the wheels and open the doors for him. I wanted his shell company to successfully absorb the dummy corporation. I wanted him to walk confidently into a federally insured bank, present those forged documents, and use my fake assets as collateral to secure a massive real-world loan to pay off his dangerous venture capital debt. Evelyn understood the assignment immediately. The moment Bradley signed his name on those bank loan documents using forged corporate papers to secure capital, he was no longer committing state-level white-collar crime. He was committing federal bank fraud. He was walking straight into a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence, and we were going to personally hand him the pen to sign his own life away. For 14 grueling nights, I lived a dangerous double life. By day, I was a drooling tragedy, requiring assistance just to drink water. By night, I was a corporate sniper, tracking every single move my arrogant brother-in-law made. Evelyn hacked into the public registry and quietly monitored the progress of his fraudulent filings. We watched him confidently move the chess pieces exactly where we wanted them. He officially transferred the title of my Aspen cabin. He submitted the hostile takeover paperwork. He walked right into the federal bear trap with a massive victorious smile on his face. Finally, the day of my hospital discharge arrived. Dr. Harrison signed my release papers with a heavy, heartbroken sigh, advising my family that I would need round-the-clock physical care and extensive cognitive therapy for the rest of my life. Simone pushed my wheelchair out the double doors of the hospital, acting the part of the weary but fiercely devoted sister for the watching medical staff. Bradley loaded me into the back of his luxury SUV, handling me like a fragile piece of broken glass that he owned. They were taking me straight to Mama Joyce's house. It was Sunday, and in our family Sunday dinner was an absolute mandatory event no matter the circumstances. Mama Joyce had insisted on hosting a welcome home meal, ostensibly to pray for my non-existent recovery, but secretly to celebrate their impending massive financial windfall. They had invited the extended family, the aunts and uncles and church elders who always blindly followed Mama Joyce's toxic lead. As Bradley drove us through the wealthy manicured suburbs of Atlanta, I leaned my head against the cool leather window, playing the part of the silent, heavily medicated invalid. I listened to Simone happily discussing her plans to remodel her kitchen with imported Italian marble, and Bradley bragging about a massive corporate business deal he was closing tomorrow. The smell of Mama Joyce's famous candied yams and fried chicken would soon fill the air, masking the stench of their betrayal. They thought they were bringing home a defeated, broken burden. They thought they had successfully stolen my life's work and my future. They had absolutely no idea they were chauffeuring their own executioner straight to the dinner table. When we arrived at Mama Joyce's house, Bradley did not even bother carrying me inside. He had one of my younger teenage cousins wheel my chair up the steep wooden ramp and push me straight into the dark, stuffy guest bedroom at the very back of the house. Simone trailed behind us, reeking of expensive perfume and fake concern. She casually tossed a thin, scratchy blanket over my lap and told me in a sickly sweet voice to take a nice long nap while the adults enjoyed their Sunday dinner. They shut the heavy wooden door firmly behind them, leaving me completely alone in the dark shadows of the room. That was their first massive mistake. They assumed I was completely paralyzed by my injuries and trapped in a shattered mind. But the heavy medical cast on my leg was actually a removable walking boot, provided by a highly sympathetic physical therapist that Clara had secretly connected me with at the hospital. And tucked discreetly beneath the bulky, oversized hospital sweater I was wearing was a sleek garment bag. My attorney Evelyn had managed to sneak it into the house earlier that morning, bribing a catering delivery boy to stash it in the back closet. The moment the door clicked shut, I threw off the blanket and stood up. The pain in my fractured ribs was a dull, persistent ache, but it was easily ignored by the rushing, thrilling wave of adrenaline flooding my veins. I unstrapped the heavy medical boot from my leg and stepped into a pair of sharp white stiletto heels. I quickly peeled off the depressing gray hospital clothes, tossing them onto the floor like shed skin. I unzipped the garment bag and slipped into the flawless, tailored white power suit Evelyn had brought me. It fit perfectly, acting as my armor for the war I was about to wage. I brushed out my hair, applied a bold slash of crimson lipstick, and stared at my reflection in the dusty mirror of the guest room. The broken, tragic victim was officially dead. The corporate sniper had returned. Down the hall, the dining room was alive with uproarious, joyous laughter. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses and heavy silver cutlery echoed through the large house. The rich smell of Mama Joyce's famous honey-baked ham, candied yams, and buttery cornbread filled the air, mocking the sheer toxicity of the people consuming it. I cracked the bedroom door open and walked silently down the plush-carpeted hallway, listening closely to the vile celebration unfolding in my mother's extravagant dining room. Mama Joyce was holding court at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, wearing a bright purple silk dress and her heaviest gold jewelry. I could hear her loud, booming voice praising the Lord for Bradley's incredible business acumen. She proudly announced to my aunts, uncles, and a few high-ranking church elders that Bradley had miraculously salvaged my failing hotel investments, saving the entire family from utter financial ruin and public embarrassment. The entire table erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Then I heard Bradley stand up. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. His voice dripped with that familiar, arrogant slime I had come to despise. He confidently raised his glass and thanked Mama Joyce for her unwavering support during this devastating family tragedy. He proposed a toast to new beginnings, massive financial returns, and the enduring strength of family loyalty. I did not wait for them to take a single sip of their expensive champagne. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak double doors to the dining room wide open. The brass hinges groaned loudly, cutting right through the ambient noise of the dinner party like a knife. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the warm, glowing light of the crystal chandelier. My bright white suit caught the light, making me impossible to ignore. I kept my posture impossibly straight, my shoulders pulled back and my chin held high. My white stiletto heels clicked with sharp rhythmic authority against the hardwood floor, echoing like gunshots in the sudden quiet. I walked right past the antique buffet table, completely ignoring the spread of food, and stopped at the very foot of the dining table, directly opposite Mama Joyce. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying to witness. The uproarious laughter died instantly in their throats. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. A dead, heavy silence fell over the massive room like a suffocating lead blanket. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me in pure, unadulterated shock. My Aunt Pearl actually dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud, crashing clatter. Uncle George, who had been chewing a piece of ham, froze with his mouth wide open. Simone, who had been mid-laugh with her glass of champagne hovering near her lips, turned completely pale. Her eyes, wide and terrified, frantically scanned my body, looking for the wheelchair, looking for the drooling invalid she had just dumped in the back room like garbage. Instead, she saw a fiercely lucid, powerful woman, radiating pure dominance. Bradley was still standing at his chair, holding his crystal glass suspended in the air. The smug, confident smile had melted right off his face, replaced by a look of sheer panicked confusion. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly, as if his brain was violently rejecting the image standing right in front of him. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave he had dug himself. I looked slowly around the silent table, making deliberate, searing eye contact with every single extended family member who had blindly swallowed their lies without ever bothering to check on me. Finally, I rested my cold gaze on my mother. Mama Joyce sat completely frozen at the head of the table, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent word. The heavy gold cross resting on her chest seemed to mock the absolute lack of grace in her heart. I offered them all a slow, razor-sharp smile. I told them they should really wait for all the guests of honor to arrive before making such a heartfelt toast. My voice rang out clear, steady, and dripping with condescension. It carried absolutely zero traces of the cognitive delay I had faked for 2 grueling weeks. The sound of my normal, confident voice sent a visible shockwave around the table. Simone gasped loudly, clutching the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned white. She stammered frantically, asking how I was standing and demanding to know what in the world was going on. She looked desperately from me to Bradley, hoping her brilliant husband had some rational explanation for why the woman they were supposed to be financially burying was standing in front of them, looking like a multi-million-dollar CEO. Bradley slowly lowered his glass to the table, his hand trembling slightly. He tried to summon his commanding, authoritative broker voice, but it cracked pathetically. He pointed a shaking finger at me and ordered me to sit down immediately, claiming I was having a severe manic episode induced by my brain trauma. He looked frantically at Uncle George, telling him to call an ambulance because I was clearly a danger to myself and needed to be sedated. I laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that made the surrounding family members visibly flinch and pull back in their chairs. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Bradley, closing the distance between us along the side of the table. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him the only episode happening here was the series finale of his pathetic little corporate charade. I turned to address the entire room, projecting my voice so every single church elder and gossiping aunt could hear the absolute truth. I told them I was not brain damaged. I was not paralyzed, and I was absolutely not the helpless, tragic victim they had banked their entire financial future on. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored white jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder that Evelyn had prepared for me. I held it up high, letting it catch the light of the chandelier. I told them the dinner party was officially over and the reckoning had just begun. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The air in the dining room was so thick with tension you could cut it with a butter knife. I watched the eyes of my extended family dart nervously around the table. My gaze swept across their frozen faces, taking in the forced fake smiles that had completely melted away into sheer panic. Uncle George was suddenly sweating profusely. Aunt Pearl was staring at her plate like it held the secrets of the universe. Mama Joyce was clutching her linen napkin so hard her knuckles were stark white. But my eyes stopped abruptly on the manicured hand of my sister. Simone was not going to back down. She had spent her entire life believing she was inherently superior to me, and she was not about to let a tailored white suit shatter her carefully constructed reality. She shook her head, letting out a harsh, condescending scoff that broke the heavy silence. She quickly regained her haughty composure, deciding right then and there that I was bluffing. She firmly believed that I was just a desperate, brain-damaged woman trying to put on a brave face with fake printed documents, Simone reached into the oversized designer tote bag hanging on the back of her chair. She aggressively pulled out a crisp white document and slammed it down right in the middle of Mama Joyce's pristine lace tablecloth, dangerously close to the crystal gravy boat. She looked at me with pure venom in her eyes and told me I could stand there in my little designer suit and wave around whatever fake legal papers I printed off the internet. But I was completely delusional. Her voice echoed loudly against the chandelier. She pointed a sharp acrylic nail at the paper on the table and loudly declared that my luxury penthouse was no longer mine. She informed the entire room that Bradley had officially taken over the management of my estate and he had already collateralized my $3.5 million condo. Simone proudly announced that my so-called successful hotel chain was actually bleeding money and on the verge of total bankruptcy. She claimed Bradley had to heroically step in, use his executive power of attorney, and leverage my real estate just to secure the capital needed to save the family from my massive financial failures. She crossed her arms over her chest and told me she was entirely done pretending to care about my fragile state of mind. She coldly demanded that I go back to that penthouse, pack my bags, and move out tonight. She told me I could take my clothes and my cheap shoes, but the furniture and the artwork belonged to the estate now. Bradley, who had been practically hyperventilating just moments ago, suddenly found his courage again. Watching his wife go on the attack gave him the false confidence he desperately needed to maintain his alpha male facade. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and took a step forward, trying to physically intimidate me by invading my personal space. He stood tall, puffing out his chest, and used his smooth, persuasive broker voice to back up his wife. He told me I should really be on my knees thanking him for cleaning up my disastrous financial mess. He confidently stated that the bank had already approved the loan against the penthouse, and the funds were currently being used to stabilize my failing business. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the stale alcohol on his breath and warned me not to fight this. He told me he had a team of top-tier corporate lawyers on retainer who would happily drag me into court and have me permanently committed to a psychiatric facility for my own safety if I tried to cause any legal trouble. I did not back away from him. I stood my ground, refusing to let his physical presence make me feel small ever again. I looked past his shoulder right at my mother, waiting to see if she would finally step up and defend her own flesh and blood. I waited to see if Mama Joyce would object to her youngest daughter being thrown out onto the street just days after waking up from a coma. Instead, Mama Joyce let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She looked at me with a profound, deeply insulting disappointment. She placed her hands flat on the table and told me to please stop this foolishness immediately. She scolded me for coming into her home and causing a scene at her dinner table on a Sunday of all days. She said her church friends would be absolutely appalled by my complete lack of gratitude. Mama Joyce looked me up and down, judging my crisp white suit as if it was a personal insult to her. She told me I was acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child. She said Simone and Bradley had sacrificed so much of their own time and energy to manage my affairs while I was incapacitated. She told me I had no right to burst in here demanding answers when Bradley was the man of the house, doing his absolute best to protect our family name from my reckless business decisions. She completely validated their theft right in front of the entire extended family. Then my mother delivered the final, devastating blow. She pointed toward the front door and told me to listen to my sister. She said I needed to leave her house right now, go pack a small bag, and they would kindly call an Uber to take me to a cheap motel until I could figure out what to do with my life. She actually told me I should consider it a blessing that they were giving me a few hours to collect my personal items, instead of having the building security throw me out onto the sidewalk immediately. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had orchestrated my near-fatal accident, forged legal documents, stolen my multi-million-dollar company, and now they were attempting to evict me from my own home while demanding my gratitude. Any other person might have completely broken down, crying or screaming at the sheer injustice of it all. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I slowly looked down at the document Simone had thrown onto the tablecloth. I did not even need to pick it up to know exactly what it was. It was the official notice of transfer and a certified bank statement from the federal lender Bradley had used to secure his fraudulent loan. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of his federal crime. He had actually brought the murder weapon straight to the dinner table and proudly displayed it for everyone to see. I looked back up at Simone, whose arms were still crossed in defiance. I looked at Bradley, who was smirking with arrogant victory. And I looked at Mama Joyce, who was waiting for me to lower my head and walk away in shame. I did not yell. I did not scream. I just smiled. A slow, genuine, chilling smile that made the smug satisfaction instantly drain from Bradley's face. I reached my hand out and rested my fingertips lightly on the crisp white eviction notice, completely ready to drop the bomb that would burn their entire world to ashes. My fingertips rested lightly on the crisp white paper, but I did not pick it up. I did not even bother to read the fine print. Instead, I slowly pushed it back across the lace tablecloth toward Simone, leaving a faint smudge on the pristine surface. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice absolutely level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. I told Simone she could keep her little printout because it was completely useless to me. Simone rolled her eyes and crossed her arms again, preparing to launch into another loud tirade about my supposed delusion. But I cut her off before she could even draw a breath. I turned my attention entirely to Bradley, who was watching my every move with the hyper-vigilant stare of a cornered predator trying to calculate his escape route. He was desperately trying to maintain his confident posture, but I could see a tiny bead of sweat forming right at his temple. I looked him dead in the eyes and asked him if he really thought I was that stupid. I asked him if he honestly believed that a black woman who built a $15 million empire from absolute scratch in a highly competitive city like Atlanta would leave her entire life's work completely unprotected. I told him I knew exactly what kind of greedy, entitled vultures were always circling my success, waiting for a moment of weakness to swoop in and pick my bones clean. I just never expected those vultures to be sitting down for Sunday dinner at my own mother's dining room table. A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. Aunt Pearl clutched her pearls, and Uncle George shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But I ignored them all. I reached into the sleek leather designer bag hanging from my shoulder and pulled out a thick-bound legal document. It was sealed with a heavy red wax stamp, representing the highest level of corporate authentication. I dropped it onto the table right on top of Simone's printed eviction notice. The heavy thud made the crystal gravy boat rattle and the champagne in their glasses tremble. I told Bradley to go ahead and open it. I told him he might want to read the actual authentic paperwork before he started bragging to his entire extended family about his brilliant hostile takeover. Bradley hesitated. His eyes darted nervously from my face to the heavy document resting on the table. He did not want to touch it. His instincts were screaming at him that the file was a trap, but his massive ego would not allow him to back down in front of an audience. Uncle George nudged him, urging him to just open the file, prove me wrong and get this over with so they could finish their meal. Bradley slowly reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. His eyes scanned the first page. I watched the exact moment his entire world stopped spinning. The smug, vibrant color completely vanished from his face, leaving behind an ashen, sickly gray. His breathing hitched in his throat, and his pupils dilated in pure, unadulterated terror. He quickly flipped to the second page, and then the third, his hands shaking so violently that the thick paper audibly rattled. I decided to explain it loudly so the rest of the family could understand exactly what was happening right in front of them. I told them that the transfer documents Bradley had practically forced me to sign while I was heavily sedated and fighting for my life in the intensive care unit were entirely legally binding. I told them he had indeed used my medical emergency to transfer ownership of a corporate entity bearing my name. I even offered him a slow mocking round of applause, congratulating him on successfully stealing a holding company. Simone looked confused, her brow furrowed as she looked from my clapping hands to her husband's pale face. She demanded to know what a holding company meant and why Bradley looked like he was about to pass out. I dropped the bomb with absolute surgical precision. I told her that the holding company her husband just spent $50,000 bribing a corrupt notary to acquire was a complete ghost. I explained that it was a dummy corporation I had set up years ago solely for administrative routing. It held absolutely zero capital. It held zero real estate. It did not own the $15 million boutique hotel chain, and it certainly did not own the $3.5 million penthouse he just tried to kick me out of. Simone's jaw dropped. She slammed her hand flat on the mahogany table, causing her rings to clatter against the wood. She screamed that I was lying. She yelled that Bradley had seen my bank statements and tracked my assets for months. She snatched the file out of Bradley's trembling hands and tried to read the complex legal jargon herself. But her eyes just darted wildly over the pages, unable to comprehend the corporate trap she was staring at. I kept my voice perfectly calm as I delivered the final crushing blow to their reality. I told them that my real empire, every single hotel property, every corporate bank account, and the deed to my luxury penthouse were placed inside an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust over 3 years ago. I explained that an irrevocable trust is a legally binding fortress. Once the assets go inside, not even I have the legal power to easily transfer them to a third party on a whim. The assets belong solely to the trust, and the trust is managed by an aggressive independent legal board that Bradley has absolutely no access to. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table, asserting my total dominance over the room. I told Bradley that the papers he made me sign, the ones he was so incredibly proud of, merely gave his shell company control of an empty box. I told him he had stolen a name on a piece of paper and nothing else. The silence in the dining room was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Mama Joyce looked frantically between me and Bradley, waiting for him to laugh and tell everyone I was making this all up. She desperately wanted her golden son-in-law to assert his dominance and put me back in my place. But Bradley could not speak. He was staring blindly at the red wax seal on the document, gasping for air like a fish out of water. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the weight of a freight train. He had not just failed to steal my money. He had taken those forged documents, those empty, worthless papers, and presented them to a major federal bank. He had proudly claimed he owned $15 million in luxury real estate and used that completely fabricated collateral to secure a massive loan to pay off his dangerous venture capital debt. He had offered up empty air to the federal government in exchange for millions of dollars in cold, hard cash. Simone dropped the file back onto the table as if it had physically burned her. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the woman standing before her was not a broken victim playing dress-up. I was the architect of their total destruction. I had let them walk right through the front door of my trap, and I had quietly locked it right behind them. I smiled again, looking directly at my mother, whose face was frozen in absolute horror. I asked her if she still wanted to call me an Uber, or if I should just stay for dessert. I told her it would be a shame to miss the final course, considering this was going to be the last Sunday dinner this family would ever share outside of a federal visitation room. I looked down at Bradley, who was now physically shrinking in his expensive mahogany chair. He was no longer the imposing, wealthy investment broker who had stood over my hospital bed and whispered vile threats into my ear in the dead of night. He was a terrified little boy, caught in a lie of catastrophic proportions. I stood tall, letting the crisp tailoring of my white suit serve as a stark contrast to his rapidly unraveling composure. I leaned in slightly, making sure every single word I said next was carved permanently into his memory. I asked him if he knew the exact legal definition of federal bank fraud. I did not wait for his answer. I told him that when a person intentionally uses forged corporate documents and non-existent collateral to secure a multi-million-dollar loan from an institution insured by the federal government, they have crossed a very specific line. I explained that this was no longer a civil dispute over a family inheritance or a simple misunderstanding between relatives. It was a Class C felony. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. His chest was heaving under his silk shirt as his brain scrambled to comprehend the massive legal bear trap closing around his ankles. I kept pushing, driving the nail completely through his coffin. I told him the bank did not just give him that money based on his charming smile and white privilege. They wired millions of dollars across state lines into his failing brokerage firm based entirely on the fraudulent paperwork he had signed under penalty of perjury. And the moment that wire transfer cleared, he added federal wire fraud to his rapidly growing list of federal indictments. Simone finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, grabbing Bradley by the lapels of his tailored jacket. She shook him frantically, screaming at him to say something to tell everyone I was lying. She demanded to know if he had actually taken a loan against a fake company and put their entire livelihood at risk. Bradley could not even look at her. He just stared blankly at the red wax seal on my trust document, his mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute despair. Seeing her golden son-in-law completely crumble finally broke Mama Joyce out of her trance. She stood up so fast, her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and yelled that I was a wicked, vindictive child. She commanded me to call my lawyers right this second and undo whatever demonic trap I had set for my sister's husband. She screamed that family protects family and that God would severely punish me for trying to destroy my own flesh and blood over a simple misunderstanding about a hotel chain. I turned my head and locked eyes with my mother. I felt no anger toward her anymore. I only felt a cold, hollow pity. I told her that family does indeed protect family, which is exactly why I was protecting myself from the absolute parasites sitting in this room. I reminded her that her precious son-in-law did not just try to steal my money. I raised my voice so the entire room could hear the darkest truth of all. I told them Bradley slipped a lethal muscle relaxant into my intravenous drip before I left the hospital parking lot, causing the car crash that nearly snapped my spine in half. I told her he tried to murder me, and she sat at the foot of my hospital bed and thanked him for being the savior of our family. The entire dining room erupted into sheer chaos. Aunt Pearl began crying loudly, burying her face in her linen napkin. Uncle George grabbed his chest, looking like he was about to have a heart attack right onto the honey-baked ham. Simone let go of Bradley's jacket and backed away from him, stumbling into the antique buffet table. She covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in violent aggressive denial as the reality of her husband's murderous actions washed over her. Bradley finally found his voice. It was a high-pitched, desperate whine that completely stripped him of any remaining dignity. He grabbed the edge of the table and begged me to stop. He said we could fix this right now, quietly and discreetly. He promised to transfer the money back to the bank first thing Monday morning. He frantically swore he would sign whatever papers I wanted, give me his own personal assets, and walk away from my company forever. He begged me to just keep this in the family and not involve the authorities, because a federal charge would completely ruin his pristine reputation in the Atlanta financial sector. I looked down at him, feeling the absolute supreme power of my position. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and told him it was far too late for closed-door negotiations. I explained that I did not come here today to threaten him or to force him to return what he stole. I came here to deliver his receipt. I told him I had already forwarded the pristine audio recording of his midnight hospital confession, along with the forged transfer documents, the bribed notary signature, and the bank loan statements directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had my attorney Evelyn personally hand-deliver the evidence to the White-Collar Crime Division at 9:00 yesterday morning. I told him they had been tracking his bank accounts for the last 24 hours, and they were very eager to ask him about his $10 million debt to an illegal venture capital fund. Bradley's eyes widened to the size of saucers. The last remaining drop of blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He slumped backward, his spine hitting the back of the mahogany dining chair with a heavy, dull thud. His arms fell limply to his sides, and he stared up at the crystal chandelier, completely and utterly defeated. The arrogant predator had finally realized he was nothing but prey. Right on cue, the faint, piercing wail of police sirens broke through the quiet evening air of the affluent neighborhood. It started as a distant hum, but grew rapidly louder and more distinct with every passing second, echoing through the manicured streets. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect aggressively through the sheer curtains of Mama Joyce's large bay windows, painting the shocked, terrified faces of my family in alternating colors of absolute panic. I stepped back from the table, smoothly adjusting the lapels of my crisp white suit. I looked at the incredible feast laid out before them, the expensive champagne, the fine china, the perfectly roasted meats. It was a banquet meticulously designed to celebrate my total destruction. Now it was just the pathetic backdrop for their total ruin. The sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt in the driveway echoed loudly through the room, followed by the aggressive slamming of car doors. Heavy, rapid footsteps began pounding up the front porch steps, signaling the end of Bradley's freedom and the absolute destruction of Mama Joyce's precious public image. Every single neighbor on this affluent street was currently watching the federal government raid the home of the church's most highly decorated member. I looked at Mama Joyce, who was now openly weeping, clutching her gold cross necklace, as if it could somehow magically shield her from the consequences of her own toxic parenting. I looked at Simone, who was pressed against the wall, looking at her husband like he was a monster she had never met before. And finally, I looked down at Bradley one last time as he sat paralyzed in his chair, waiting for the heavy knock on the front door that would end his life as he knew it. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet, intoxicating scent of absolute victory. I told them all to stay right where they were because their guests of honor had finally arrived. Then I turned on my heels and walked toward the front hallway, ready to pull open the door and officially welcome the authorities into my mother's house. The heavy, authoritative pounding on the solid oak front door echoed through the silent hallway like the beating of a war drum. A booming voice from the porch ordered everyone inside to open the door immediately, identifying themselves as federal agents. The sheer reality of those words acted like a live wire dropped straight into a puddle of water right in the middle of Mama Joyce's pristine dining room. the fragile illusion of our perfect family shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. Simone was the first one to crack. Her instinct for self-preservation kicked in, completely overriding any vows of marriage or loyalty she had ever sworn to Bradley. She took 3 rapid steps backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had proudly flaunted just 5 minutes earlier. She looked at his pale, sweating face, and her expression twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. She did not lower her voice. She wanted the federal agent standing on the porch to hear her performance loud and clear. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, pointing a shaking acrylic nail directly at Bradley's chest. She declared that he was a monster and a compulsive liar. She told the entire room that she had absolutely no idea he was committing federal fraud or forging corporate documents. She claimed she was just a devoted, supportive wife who blindly trusted her husband to manage their finances. She cried out that he had manipulated her, used her good name, and put her precious mother's stellar reputation in the church at severe risk for his own selfish greed. Simone was desperately trying to build her legal defense right there on the Persian rug. She looked frantically at Aunt Pearl and Uncle George, begging them to act as character witnesses for her. She sobbed that she was an innocent victim of a manipulative sociopath and that she would never do anything to jeopardize her family or her standing in the community. She was entirely willing to feed Bradley to the wolves if it meant she could walk away with her pristine image completely intact. She actually yelled toward the front door, declaring her innocence to the agents waiting outside. Bradley stared at his wife as she loudly threw him under the bus. The shock on his face rapidly hardened into something incredibly dark and deeply vicious. He was a cornered animal facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and he was absolutely not going to go down alone. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut right through Simone's theatrical sobbing. The sound was so completely unhinged that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The polished investment broker was gone, replaced by a venomous, desperate man ready to destroy anyone in his path. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them, and grabbed Simone roughly by the arm. She shrieked, trying to pull away, but his grip was like a steel vice. He leaned into her face, his voice dripping with pure, malicious venom. He told her she was the worst actress he had ever seen in his entire life. He mocked her innocent church-girl routine, asking her if she was going to tell the Federal Bureau of Investigation about her little pharmaceutical experiment, or if he should do the honors of explaining exactly how my car ended up wrapped around a concrete barrier. Simone froze completely. The fake tears instantly dried up, leaving her eyes wide with genuine, paralyzing terror. She desperately tried to shush him, shaking her head in tiny, frantic movements, but the dam had already broken. Bradley turned his head and projected his voice, making sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. He told the family that he might have forged the paperwork, but Simone was the one who handed him the keys to the kingdom. He explicitly revealed that on the morning of my car crash, Simone was the one who crushed up 3 highly potent muscle relaxants and dissolved them into my favorite sports water bottle. He said she handed it to me with a bright, loving smile right before I got behind the wheel of my car to drive on the interstate. He spat the words out like poison, detailing how Simone had meticulously planned the dosage. She knew it would not kill me instantly, but it would cause me to lose consciousness while driving at highway speeds, guaranteeing a catastrophic accident. She was the one who wanted a closed-casket funeral so she could play the grieving sister and inherit my empire without getting her own hands completely dirty. He laughed again, a cruel barking sound, telling her she was going down for attempted premeditated murder. He proudly announced that he had kept every single text message she sent him planning the attack, and he was going to happily provide them to the federal prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. The sound that came out of Mama Joyce's mouth was not a scream. It was a guttural, agonizing wheeze of a woman watching her entire universe violently implode. She stumbled backward, her knees buckling beneath her heavy purple silk dress. She crashed heavily into the antique buffet table, sending a silver platter of deviled eggs crashing to the hardwood floor. She clutched the fabric of her dress right over her heart, gasping desperately for air as the room spun around her. Her golden child, the daughter she had placed on a pedestal her entire life, the woman she had proudly praised in front of her congregation just hours ago, was not just a thief. She was a cold-blooded attempted murderer. Mama Joyce looked at Simone with a horrified, shattered expression. She tried to speak, to ask Simone to deny the horrific accusations, but no words came out. The sheer stress of the revelation, coupled with the flashing police lights illuminating the room, was physically breaking her down. The pristine image she had sacrificed my entire childhood to protect was dead. Simone did not even look at our mother to offer comfort or denial. She was too busy screaming furiously at Bradley, calling him a deadbeat failure who could not even execute a simple hostile takeover without ruining both of their lives. They were physically tearing each other apart right in the middle of the dining room. They were two vicious dogs locked in a cage fighting over a scrap of meat, completely oblivious to the fact that the cage was currently being loaded into a federal transport vehicle. I stood completely still by the arched entryway of the hallway, watching them destroy each other. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or seek any further revenge. My toxic family was doing all the dirty work for me. They were shredding their own legacy, exposing their darkest secrets, and confirming every single suspicion I ever had about their complete lack of morality. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of pure karma unfolding right before my eyes. The federal agents pounded on the door again, this time demanding entry with a much sharper sense of urgency. The heavy brass doorknob rattled as someone on the porch tested the lock. I took one final look at the absolute chaos in the dining room. Aunt Pearl was dialing for paramedics for Mama Joyce, who was now slumped against the wall, hyperventilating. Uncle George was simply staring at his plate, paralyzed by fear. Bradley and Simone were screaming directly into each other's faces, hurling threats of prison time and financial ruin while physically shoving each other. I turned my back on all of them. I smoothed out the lapels of my white suit, took a deep breath of the cool air seeping through the door frame, and reached out to turn the heavy brass lock. I pulled the front door wide open, stepping aside to welcome the swarm of dark federal windbreakers into the house. The reckoning was no longer just a threat hanging in the air. It was officially standing in our living room. The morning sun was reflecting blindingly off the glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta, but the atmosphere inside the sleek high-rise building was absolutely ice cold. My sharp black stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floors of the lobby. I was wearing a meticulously tailored pitch-black suit. It was the exact color of a funeral because that was precisely what I was attending today. I was here to bury the last remaining shreds of my brother-in-law's career. I did not come alone. Walking seamlessly in step beside me was my attorney Evelyn, looking like a corporate assassin in a dark navy dress and carrying a thick leather briefcase. Flanking us were two massive security contractors Evelyn had hired for the morning. When the receptionist at the front desk of Bradley's brokerage firm stood up to protest our arrival, Evelyn simply flashed a pristine legal document bound in a blue cover. The receptionist took one look at the federal seal on the paper and instantly sat back down, picking up her desk phone with trembling hands. We did not even break our stride. We approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. Through the transparent gaps in the glass, I could see exactly what was happening inside. Bradley was pacing frantically at the front of the massive oak conference table. His expensive corporate defense attorney had miraculously managed to keep him out of a federal holding cell last night, arguing that he was not a flight risk while the formal indictment was being processed. That gave Bradley a narrow 24-hour window of freedom. And like the desperate cornered rat he was using that exact window to try and rob his own company blind. He had called an emergency mandatory board meeting for 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. The senior partners and board members were sitting around the table looking utterly exhausted and deeply confused, holding cups of coffee and staring at the frantic man at the front of the room. Bradley looked completely unhinged. He was wearing the exact same suit he had worn to Sunday dinner, only now it was heavily wrinkled. His tie was loosened, his collar was unbuttoned, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his trembling hand as he barked desperate orders at the room. I paused right outside the glass doors, listening to his frantic pitch. Bradley was currently begging the board of directors to authorize an immediate emergency liquidation of all the firm's Tier 1 liquid assets. He was frantically lying to them, claiming he had received inside intelligence about a catastrophic market crash hitting the Asian markets by noon. He insisted they needed to wire all available capital into a secure offshore holding account immediately to protect their investors. He was literally trying to steal millions of dollars from his own partners so he could flee the country before the FBI officially froze his corporate accounts. I reached out and pushed the heavy glass doors wide open. They swung inward with a smooth, expensive silence, but my entrance hit the room like a physical shockwave. Bradley froze mid-sentence. His mouth hung open and his bloodshot eyes bulged out of his head. The frantic pacing stopped instantly. Every single board member turned in their heavy leather chairs to stare at the uninvited guests walking into their highly restricted meeting. I did not say a single word. I walked with absolute dominant purpose straight down the length of the conference room. I ignored the shocked murmurs of the senior partners. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Bradley, who was physically shrinking backward against the digital presentation board, with every step I took. I reached the very head of the table, the seat of absolute power that Bradley usually occupied for himself. I pulled the heavy leather executive chair out and sat down, crossing my legs and resting my hands perfectly flat on the polished oak surface. Evelyn stood directly to my right, placing her briefcase on the table while the two security contractors took up positions by the glass doors, effectively locking the room down. Bradley finally snapped out of his paralyzed terror. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He slammed his fist onto the table, trying desperately to regain control of his boardroom. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know how I got past security. He looked frantically at the senior partners and yelled that this was a private corporate meeting. He pointed at me and told them I was his mentally unstable sister-in-law who had just suffered a traumatic brain injury and was currently experiencing a violent psychotic break. He ordered the board members to call building security and have me physically dragged out of the building. None of the board members moved to pick up a phone. They were highly intelligent financial predators themselves, and they could easily read the power dynamic shifting in the room. They looked at my calm, collected posture and then at Bradley's sweating, unhinged desperation. They knew instantly that the man at the front of the room was drowning, and they had absolutely no intention of going down with his ship. I smiled a slow, chilling smile that made Bradley grip the edge of the table just to keep himself standing. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the confused, wealthy men and women sitting at the table. I introduced myself in a perfectly calm, authoritative voice. I told them my name and noted that I was the owner of the luxury boutique hotel chain their managing partner had fraudulently claimed as collateral just 3 days ago. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. The oldest partner at the table, a distinguished man with silver hair sitting to my left, narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, asking me exactly what I meant by fraudulent collateral. Bradley panicked. He lunged forward, trying to reach across the table to silence me, but one of Evelyn's security contractors took a single intimidating step forward, forcing him to retreat. Bradley started talking a mile a minute, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He told the board not to listen to a single word I said. He swore on his life that my real estate was legally bound to the firm, and that the federal loan he secured was completely legitimate. He begged them to just sign the liquidation order so they could move the money and protect the company. I did not even look at him. I kept my attention entirely on the silver-haired partner. I told the board that if they signed that liquidation order, they would not be protecting the company. They would be actively participating in a massive federal money laundering scheme to help their managing partner flee the country. I explained that last night the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided my mother's home and seized Bradley's personal laptop and cell phone. I told them the FBI was currently preparing a massive federal indictment against him for wire fraud, bank fraud, and the attempted murder of the very woman sitting at the head of their table. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. 2 of the younger board members immediately stood up, grabbing their briefcases and rushing toward the doors, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal crime. The silver-haired partner slammed his hands on the table, demanding Bradley explain himself right this second. The illusion of Bradley's success was completely shattered. His own partners were looking at him like he was a diseased rat. Bradley was hyperventilating now. His chest heaved and he ran his hands frantically through his messy hair. He realized his plan to steal the firm's money and run was completely dead. The only thing he had left was his blind, venomous pride. He turned his rage entirely onto me. He marched up to the side of the table, leaning over so his face was inches from mine. He screamed that I was a vindictive, completely arrogant bitch. He yelled that I had absolutely no legal right to sit in his chair or be in his building. He pounded his fist on the table, declaring that he was the majority shareholder of this firm and that I held absolutely zero equity in his company. He demanded I get out of his boardroom before he called the police himself. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch away from his screaming red face. I just sat there, letting his final pathetic display of false power echo off the glass walls. He had just handed me the absolute perfect setup for the final crushing blow. I looked up at him, my eyes completely dead of any mercy, and prepared to unveil the ultimate twist that would officially end his life as he knew it. His face was inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged as he continued to scream that I was nothing. He slammed his fists on the polished oak table, demanding security remove me. He shouted that he built this firm from the ground up, and I was just a jealous outsider with absolutely zero shares in his brokerage. I sat perfectly still, letting his frantic energy wash over me like a warm breeze. I looked directly into his bloodshot, wild eyes. My own expression was a mask of absolute cold, calculating ice. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply waited for him to run out of breath. When his screaming finally dissolved into heavy, pathetic panting, I reached out and gently tapped the table with my manicured fingernail. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. I told him I did not own a single share of equity in his failing corrupt brokerage firm. I told him equity implies a partnership, and I would never in a million years partner with a man as breathtakingly incompetent as him. I leaned back in his heavy leather executive chair and snapped my fingers. Evelyn moved with the lethal efficiency of a trained corporate assassin. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a small black remote. She aimed it at the ceiling and pressed a single button. The heavy mechanical hum of the boardroom projector instantly filled the dead silence. The massive motorized projection screen began to lower slowly, covering the glass wall right behind Bradley. Bradley spun around, staring at the blank white screen, as the projector warmed up, casting a bright rectangular light across his terrified face. The remaining board members leaned forward in their chairs, completely captivated by the execution they were witnessing. Evelyn typed rapidly on her tablet, syncing it directly to the boardroom display. I kept my eyes locked onto Bradley. I told him that while I did not own his equity, I did own something far more powerful. I owned his debt. The projector screen flashed to life. A massive, highly detailed organizational chart appeared in crisp, high definition. At the very bottom of the chart was Bradley's brokerage firm, with a thick red line pointing directly upward, indicating a massive $10 million liability. I walked him through the graphics, speaking slowly and clearly, so the entire board of directors could fully understand the sheer magnitude of his financial incompetence. I told them all about the ruthless private venture capital fund that Bradley had turned to when his unauthorized trades wiped out his personal accounts. I explained how he had borrowed $10 million from shadow lenders, desperate to cover his tracks and keep up his lavish lifestyle. I pointed to the logo of the venture capital fund, glowing brightly on the screen. Bradley stared at the logo, his chest heaving. He stammered, asking how I knew about the fund and where I got these internal financial documents. He was still trying to cling to the delusion that he was the smartest person in the room. He actually tried to laugh, a weak, pathetic sound, claiming that the venture capital fund was going to destroy me for hacking into their private servers. I did not smile. I just signaled Evelyn to click to the next slide. The screen transitioned to a complex web of corporate ownership. It showed the venture capital fund being wholly acquired by a larger holding group. That holding group was owned by a parent conglomerate. And sitting at the very top of the corporate pyramid, glowing in bold black letters, was a single private entity named Black Diamond Capital Management. I looked at Bradley, who was now trembling so violently he had to grip the back of a leather chair just to stay on his feet. I asked him if he remembered when I launched my third boutique hotel in Chicago 2 years ago. I asked him if he remembered sitting at Mama Joyce's dining table laughing at my business model and telling the entire family that women simply lack the killer instinct required for high-level finance. I told him that on that exact same day, my forensic accountant had flagged a series of highly suspicious wire transfers originating from my personal bank accounts. Someone had been quietly skimming thousands of dollars trying to cover their own margin calls. I told him it took my tech team exactly 48 hours to trace the embezzlement directly back to his secure computer network. Bradley opened his mouth to deny it, but the words completely failed him. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the heavy wooden lever being pulled. I told him I could have gone to the police right then and there. I could have sent him to jail for a few years for petty embezzlement. But that was entirely too easy. I told him I wanted to know exactly why the great Bradley was stealing from his little sister-in-law. So I hired private investigators. I dug into his firm's private ledgers. I found the $10 million debt he owed to those ruthless lenders. And then I made the absolute best financial investment of my entire life. I pointed to the top of the chart on the projector screen. I told him I used my own private wealth to quietly buy out the venture capital fund. I purchased his massive debt for pennies on the dollar because the original lenders knew his firm was circling the drain. I restructured the entire corporate hierarchy, hiding my true identity behind multiple layers of shell companies and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I stood up from the executive chair, slowly buttoning my pitch-black suit jacket. I walked around the massive oak table, closing the distance between us, until I was standing right in front of him. I looked up into his horrified, bloodshot eyes. I told him I am the venture capital fund Bradley. I am the shadow lender you have been terrified of for the last 2 years. I am the parent company, the holding group, and the sole executive chairman of Black Diamond Capital Management. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. His knees actually buckled. He dropped heavily into the nearest chair, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. The senior partners sitting around the table were completely speechless, staring at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. The silver-haired partner took off his glasses, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at the staggering level of Bradley's sheer stupidity. I leaned down, resting my hands firmly on the leather armrests of his chair, trapping him in place. I lowered my voice so only he and the closest board members could hear the absolute venom dripping from every single syllable. I told him he had spent his entire life looking down on me. He had mocked my intelligence, dismissed my hard work, and treated me like a second-class citizen in my own family just because I was a black woman who refused to worship his mediocrity. He thought he was untouchable because of his gender, his race, and his expensive suits. He thought he could steal my company, poison my body, and literally pull the plug on my life support machines to pay off his massive debts. I leaned even closer until my face was mere inches from his sweating, pale skin. I told him the ultimate punchline to his pathetic joke of a life. I told him he poisoned me to steal $15 million so he could pay off a $10 million debt to me. He literally tried to murder his sole creditor. I stood back up, smoothing out the crisp lines of my jacket. I told him he does not own his brokerage firm. He does not own his luxury cars, his tailored suits, or the multi-million-dollar mansion he sleeps in. I own every single asset attached to his name. I own his debt, his freedom, and his entire future. And as of this exact moment, I am officially calling in the loan in full. Bradley covered his face with his trembling hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed pathetically against the glass walls of the boardroom. The arrogant, untouchable predator had been completely stripped of his armor, his wealth, and his dignity. He was reduced to a crying, broken shell of a man, realizing entirely too late that the woman he tried to bury was the exact same woman who owned the graveyard. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of Bradley weeping into his hands. I stood at the head of the massive oak table, completely unbothered by his tears. The wide expanse of the room seemed to shrink around him, pressing him down into the leather chair, while I stood tall, breathing in the crisp air of total victory. The senior partners sat completely frozen, their eyes darting between the broken man weeping in the corner and the black woman who had just masterfully dismantled his entire existence. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody reached out to comfort him. The illusion of his power was shattered into a million irreversible pieces. I looked down at him, feeling a profound sense of closure. The terrified, helpless woman lying in that hospital bed was gone forever. In her place was a fortress of a woman who had just conquered her greatest enemy using his own unchecked greed. I took a slow, deliberate step back from his chair, giving myself a clear view of the heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the room. I raised my right hand into the air. I looked directly at Evelyn, who gave me a sharp, confirming nod. Then I snapped my fingers. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the quiet boardroom. On cue, the two massive security contractors stepped completely aside. The heavy glass doors swung wide open, hitting the doorstops with a dull, heavy thud. A team of 6 federal agents marched directly into the room. They wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. Their heavy boots stomped in perfect unison against the polished marble floor, projecting an aura of absolute unstoppable authority. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression, walked straight down the length of the conference table. He did not look at the board members. He did not look at me. He kept his piercing gaze locked entirely on the sweating, sobbing mess of a man sitting in the corner. The agent stopped just feet away from Bradley and held up a federal badge gleaming silver under the bright fluorescent lights. The agent spoke in a loud, booming voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He stated Bradley's full legal name and announced that he was being placed under immediate arrest. The agent read off the staggering list of federal indictments one by one: federal bank fraud, aggravated wire fraud, interstate money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and finally, the most devastating charge of all, the premeditated attempted murder of his sister-in-law. Every single charge hung heavy in the cold air of the boardroom. The senior partners recoiled physically. pushing their chairs away from the table to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the man they had once called their managing partner. The silver-haired executive actually covered his mouth in sheer horror when the attempted murder charge was announced, finally realizing that he had been taking financial orders from a violent sociopath. Bradley stopped crying the moment he saw the federal badges. Pure primal terror took over his entire body. He scrambled backward in his chair, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the floor, trying desperately to escape, but his back was already pressed flat against the glass wall. There was nowhere left to run. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes wide and completely deranged, begging anyone to step in and save him. He looked at his expensive corporate defense attorney sitting 2 seats down. He screamed at the lawyer, demanding he file an emergency injunction and stop the agents from touching him. But the lawyer simply closed his thick leather briefcase, clicked the golden latches shut, and stood up. The attorney looked down at Bradley and coldly stated that his retainer did not cover federal homicide charges, and he was officially withdrawing his legal counsel effective immediately. The lawyer turned his back and walked straight out of the room, abandoning Bradley to his absolute ruin. 2 federal agents stepped forward, flanking Bradley on both sides. They reached down and grabbed him roughly by the shoulders, hauling him up onto his feet. Bradley thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and screaming that there had been a massive mistake. He yelled that he was a wealthy investment broker and they could not treat him like a common criminal. He demanded to make a phone call to the governor. The lead agent did not even blink. He grabbed Bradley's flailing arms, twisted them forcefully behind his back, and slammed him face first onto the polished oak conference table. The loud smack of Bradley's cheek hitting the wood echoed through the room. The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic clicks of the restraints, locking tightly around Bradley's wrists, sounded like the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. They yanked him back upright. His perfectly tailored suit was completely ruined, torn at the shoulder, and deeply wrinkled. His expensive silk tie was twisted around his neck like a noose. His face was bright red, smeared with snot and tears, completely stripped of the arrogant smugness he had worn like a crown for his entire adult life. He was completely humiliated, thoroughly destroyed right in front of the very board of directors he had spent years trying to impress. The agents grabbed him by the biceps and began dragging him toward the open glass doors. His shoes dragged clumsily against the marble floor, leaving long scuff marks behind. As they pulled him down the length of the boardroom, he craned his neck, looking over his shoulder directly at me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate pleading. He called my name, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine, begging me to call them off, begging me to show him mercy. I stood at the head of the table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked at him with an expression of absolute freezing indifference. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for him to hear my final parting words. I told him to enjoy his new concrete penthouse, and that I would be sure to send Mama Joyce a postcard when I sold his precious brokerage firm for scrap. Bradley let out one final agonizing scream of total defeat before the agents yanked him through the doorway and out into the bustling hallway. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off his pathetic wailing. The boardroom fell into a profound, stunned silence. The air in the room felt instantly lighter, as if a massive toxic cloud had just been violently expelled from the building. I turned away from the doors and looked back at the remaining board members. They were staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and undeniable respect. They knew exactly who held the power now. I slowly pulled out the heavy leather executive chair, the one Bradley had occupied just 20 minutes ago, and sat down at the very head of the table. I crossed my legs, leaned back, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked directly at the silver-haired partner who was sweating nervously under my intense gaze. I told the room that as the sole owner of their parent company, and the primary holder of their massive corporate debt, I was officially taking over all executive operations, effective immediately. I instructed them to cancel their golf games, clear their calendars, and prepare for a massive corporate restructuring. I told them this firm was no longer a playground for arrogant thieves, and if anyone had a problem with my new management style, they were more than welcome to follow their former boss out the front door. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody uttered a single word of protest. The silver-haired partner quickly reached for his pen and opened his notepad, nodding frantically in complete submission. I smiled a small, genuine smile of absolute triumph. The hostile takeover was finally complete. I stood up from the executive chair, leaving the stunned board members to process their new reality. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom slid shut behind me, cutting off the nervous whispers of the senior partners. I walked toward the private executive elevator, my black stiletto heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet of the hallway. I pressed the call button and watched the digital floor numbers count down. When the polished steel doors glided open, I stepped inside and turned around, watching the corporate fortress I had just conquered disappear as the doors closed. The descent down to the main lobby was smooth and completely silent. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air conditioning fill my lungs. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a profound, absolute lightness in my chest. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to earn the love of a family that actively despised me was completely gone. The elevator chimed softly, signaling my arrival at the ground floor. The doors slid open, revealing a scene of absolute spectacular chaos in the expansive marble lobby of the building. Federal agents were swarming the area, coordinating the massive seizure of Bradley's corporate assets. Building security guards were desperately trying to hold back a growing crowd of curious onlookers and corporate employees who had gathered to watch the spectacular downfall of their managing partner. But my eyes immediately locked onto a pathetic scene unfolding near the revolving front doors. Simone was standing there, flanked by two female FBI agents. The glamorous, untouchable golden child was entirely gone. Her designer dress was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. Her perfect blowout was a tangled mess, and her expensive mascara had run down her cheeks in thick black streaks. Her wrists were securely bound in front of her by heavy steel handcuffs that glinted harshly under the bright lobby lights. The federal agents had moved swiftly after Bradley's confession at the house last night, securing an immediate arrest warrant for her active role in poisoning me. Simone was shivering uncontrollably, looking around the lobby with wide, terrified eyes like a trapped animal. She was no longer the arrogant woman who had tossed a fake eviction notice onto a dining table just 24 hours ago. She was a broken criminal facing a mandatory minimum sentence for attempted murder. Suddenly, a loud, hysterical wail cut through the low murmur of the crowded lobby. Mama Joyce broke through the perimeter of security guards, her heavy purple silk dress swishing wildly around her legs. She must have followed the federal convoy from the house, completely frantic and desperate to protect her favorite daughter. Her signature gold cross necklace bounced erratically against her chest, and her normally immaculate hair was in absolute disarray. Mama Joyce spotted me stepping out of the executive elevator. Her eyes widened, and she scrambled across the polished marble floor, pushing past a federal agent to get to me. She threw herself entirely at my feet. My mother, a woman who cared more about her pristine image in the church community than she cared about her own children, collapsed right onto her knees in the middle of a crowded corporate lobby. She grabbed the fabric of my tailored black pants, her hands shaking violently. She looked up at me, her face completely twisted in agonizing desperation. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She began to beg. Her voice was a loud, hysterical screech that echoed off the high glass ceilings, drawing the stares of every single person in the room. She begged me to call off the federal agents. She pleaded with me to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She cried out that Simone was fragile and delicate and would absolutely never survive a day in a federal prison. Mama Joyce frantically tried to rewrite history right there on the floor. She blamed absolutely everything on Bradley. She swore that Simone was just a naive, devoted wife who had been brainwashed by a wicked man. She begged me to remember that we were sisters bound by holy blood. She invoked the name of God, crying out that the Lord demands forgiveness and that I was committing a grave sin by allowing my own flesh and blood to be hauled away in chains. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sadness. I simply felt an icy, hollow detachment. Even now, after hearing that Simone had intentionally crushed lethal muscle relaxants into my water bottle to orchestrate a fatal car crash, Mama Joyce did not care about my pain. She did not care that I had spent weeks in a coma fighting for every single breath. She did not ask how I was feeling or express a single ounce of horror that her oldest daughter had tried to murder her youngest. Her only concern, her absolute driving priority, was saving her golden child from the consequences of her own horrific actions. I looked over Mama Joyce's shoulder directly at Simone. Simone caught my gaze. She stopped struggling against the federal agents and stared at me. Her lips trembled, and she silently mouthed the word, "Please." The sheer audacity of her silent plea was breathtaking. She wanted me to save her life after she had ruthlessly tried to end mine. I looked back down at Mama Joyce, who was now openly sobbing and pressing her forehead against my knees, completely abandoning any shred of her dignified church persona. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed her wrists. I did not do it gently. I pried her shaking hands off my clothing, peeling her fingers back one by one. I stepped back, forcing her to remain kneeling on the cold, hard marble, completely unsupported. The lobby had gone entirely quiet. The federal agents, the security guards, and the corporate employees were all watching this intimate, devastating family destruction unfold. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting total unbreakable authority. I looked down into my mother's tear-soaked eyes, making sure she heard every single syllable I was about to speak. I told her she was wasting her prayers on the wrong daughter. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of any emotion. I told her that the federal government does not operate on church forgiveness, and they certainly do not care about her manufactured reputation. Mama Joyce gasped, reaching out for me again, but I took another deliberate step backward, completely out of her reach. I looked at her with an expression of absolute finality. You always chose her, Mama. I let the words hang in the cold air, letting the absolute truth of that statement sink into her bones. You chose her when we were children, you chose her when she stole my property, and you chose her when you found out she tried to put me in a grave. You wanted to protect her so badly. Well, now you have the rest of your life to visit your golden child in a federal prison. Mama Joyce let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing scream. She slumped forward, pressing her face against the marble floor, weeping with a profound, absolute despair. Simone let out a loud sob as the federal agents finally pushed her forward, marching her roughly toward the revolving glass doors. I did not stay to watch them load my sister into the back of a federal transport vehicle. I turned my back on the pathetic wailing of the woman who used to be my mother. I walked with sharp, purposeful strides toward the private VIP exit at the side of the lobby. The heavy glass doors slid open automatically, welcoming me into the bright, warm morning sunlight of Atlanta. A sleek black SUV was idling perfectly at the curb. Evelyn's private driver immediately stepped out and pulled the heavy armored door open for me. I stepped up into the luxurious leather interior of the vehicle, settling into the deep, comfortable seat. I reached out and grabbed the heavy handle, pulling the door shut with a solid, definitive thud. The tinted windows completely blocked out the chaos of the building, the flashing police lights, and the broken remnants of my toxic family. I leaned my head back against the headrest, instructed the driver to take me back to my luxury hotel, and never looked back. It has been over a year since I walked out of that corporate lobby and stepped into the warm Atlanta sunlight. The air in my living room tonight smells of burning cedar and expensive red wine. I am sitting comfortably on my plush velvet sofa, watching the bright orange flames dance steadily in the large stone fireplace. The heat radiates across the room, creating a cocoon of absolute tranquility. There are no frantic phone calls demanding my money. There are no toxic Sunday dinners filled with veiled insults. There is only peace. A profound, unbroken peace that I purchased with the sheer force of my own willpower. The wheels of the federal justice system turn slowly, but they grind exceptionally fine. Bradley and Simone learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. Bradley's trial was a highly publicized spectacle that completely decimated whatever was left of his reputation in the financial sector. He walked into the courtroom on the first day wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit, trying desperately to project his old, arrogant confidence. But the federal prosecutors dismantled his entire life piece by piece, right in front of a packed gallery. They played the pristine audio recording of his midnight hospital confession. They presented the forged notary documents and laid out the complex web of his massive illegal debt. They traced every single stolen dollar directly back to his greedy hands. When the judge finally handed down the sentence, Bradley actually collapsed at the defense table. He was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of parole. The man who thought he was a mastermind capable of stealing a $15 million empire is now wearing a scratchy uniform and earning 13 cents an hour working in a prison laundry room. Every single asset he ever owned was seized by the government and liquidated to pay off his mounting restitution. His prestigious brokerage firm was completely dissolved. He was left with absolutely nothing but a cold concrete cell and the agonizing daily reminder of the black woman who put him there. My sister did not fare much better. Simone tried everything in her power to play the innocent victim during her trial. She sat on the witness stand, wearing a modest conservative dress, crying crocodile tears, and claiming she was terrified of her husband. She swore she was totally unaware of his financial crimes, and that she only signed the medical papers because she was overwhelmed by grief. But Bradley kept his vicious promise. He handed the federal prosecutors every single text message she sent him on the morning of my car crash. The jury sat in stunned silence as the prosecutor read her exact words meticulously, calculating the dosage of the muscle relaxants she slipped into my water bottle. They saw the digital footprint of a woman who cold-bloodedly orchestrated a fatal accident just so she could inherit a fortune. The golden child was officially convicted of premeditated attempted murder. The judge looked down at her from the bench with absolute disgust and showed her zero mercy, sentencing her to 8 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The last time I saw my sister, she was being led out of the courtroom by 2 armed bailiffs. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by an oversized bright orange jumpsuit. Her expensive blonde highlights were fading, and her face was drawn and pale. She looked incredibly small, pathetic, and entirely ordinary. She looked exactly like the criminal she truly was. And then there was Mama Joyce. Her downfall was not televised on the evening news, but it was arguably the most devastating ruin of them all. The moment the FBI raided her home, the scandalous news spread through her pristine church community like wildfire. The very same people who used to praise her at Sunday service immediately turned their backs on her. The church elders held a private meeting and formally requested she step down from all her leadership committees, citing the severe moral failings of her household. She was treated like an absolute pariah, outcasted by the exact community she had sacrificed my entire childhood to impress. But the social exile was just the beginning of her nightmare. Desperate to save her golden child from prison, Mama Joyce completely drained her retirement savings. She took out massive high-interest loans to hire the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in Atlanta for Simone. When the cash ran out and the lawyers demanded more, she was forced to put our childhood home on the market. The massive, pristine colonial house, with the beautiful mahogany dining room where they had plotted my demise, was sold to the highest bidder at a massive loss just to pay off her mounting legal debts. Today, Mama Joyce lives completely alone in a cheap, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She has no church honors to display, no sprawling estate to host parties in, and no family left to manipulate. Simone deeply resents her for not being able to buy a better legal verdict, and absolutely refuses to call her from prison. Bradley's family actively blames her for raising a murderer. She spends her days sitting in a tiny, dark living room, entirely consumed by the bitter, agonizing reality that her own toxic favoritism destroyed everything she ever loved. She has tried to reach out to me a few times, leaving desperate, weeping voicemails, begging for financial help, or just a moment of my time. I simply delete them. I do not visit her. I do not send her money. I do not even entertain the thought of forgiveness. People often preach that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But I am not angry anymore. I am simply indifferent. The surgical removal of a tumor is a violent, painful process, but once the cancer is gone, the body finally has a chance to heal. My family was a cancer, and I cut them out of my life with absolute surgical precision. I took the massive financial empire I stripped away from Bradley, and I completely dismantled it. I did not keep his corrupted brokerage firm alive just to stroke my own ego. I liquidated every single toxic asset, every offshore account, and every empty shell company he had ever created. I took all of that reclaimed capital and I poured it directly back into the community he had spent his entire life exploiting. I funded 24 minority-owned tech startups right here in Atlanta. I expanded my boutique hotel chain, creating hundreds of high-paying jobs for people who actually needed them. I took the ultimate weapon of his white corporate greed, and I forged it into a tool for massive generational wealth for people who look exactly like me. My luxury penthouse, the very same home they tried to brutally evict me from, is no longer just a piece of expensive real estate. It is an absolute sanctuary. The walls do not echo with the sharp, condescending remarks of my sister or the heavy, suffocating demands of my mother. My home is filled with light, with genuine laughter, and with people who actually want to see me win. I still host Sunday dinners, but the guest list looks entirely different now. Clara, the brilliant intensive care nurse who risked her own career to smuggle me that micro recorder, sits at my dining table every single week. She is no longer just a hospital employee. I hired her as the executive director of wellness and health for my entire hotel brand. Evelyn, my ruthless and brilliant chief legal officer, sits right beside her. We drink expensive wine, we eat incredible food, and we celebrate our victories without ever having to tear each other down to feel powerful. We protect each other fiercely. We are a true family built on a foundation of absolute mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. I have spent a lot of time reflecting on the sheer toxicity of the bloodline I was born into. Society puts a massive, crushing amount of pressure on women, especially black women, to be the endless, bottomless well of forgiveness for their families. We are conditioned from the moment we are born to absorb the trauma, to keep the peace, to swallow our pride, and to endlessly forgive the people who continuously break our hearts. We are told that holding boundaries makes us angry, bitter, or vindictive. My mother used the word family as a weapon, a heavy, blunt instrument to beat me into submission every time I dared to ask for basic human decency. But I had to learn the hardest lesson of my entire life lying paralyzed in that cold hospital bed. I realized that you cannot buy love from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot earn respect from people who actively benefit from your destruction. And most importantly, I realized that forgiveness is an internal process meant to free your own soul. It is absolutely not a free pass for your abusers to retain unrestricted access to your life. I take a slow sip of my wine, feeling the rich warmth spread through my chest. I set the crystal glass down on the mahogany side table, and I look directly into the camera lens. I look past the digital screen, and I look straight at you. I know there is someone watching this right now who is exhausted. Someone who is tired of playing the scapegoat for a family that refuses to heal. Someone who is shrinking themselves down, hiding their success and muting their brilliance, just to make their insecure relatives feel comfortable. I know exactly how heavy that burden is because I carried it on my back for 32 years. I know the profound, paralyzing guilt that comes with finally deciding to walk away from the people who share your DNA. But I am here to tell you that the guilt is a lie. It is a manufactured chain designed to keep you tethered to a sinking ship. You have absolute permission to cut that chain. You have permission to mourn the family you deserved while simultaneously walking away from the family you were actually given. You cannot heal in the same place that made you bleed. It is a fundamental law of emotional survival. If you stay in the environment that broke you, you will spend the rest of your life desperately trying to bandage wounds that they will continuously tear open. You have to pack up your strength, your dignity, and your brilliant potential, and you have to leave the battlefield entirely. DNA does not make you family. It is nothing more than a biological coincidence. Loyalty and respect do. Consistency does. Showing up in the darkest moments when there is absolutely nothing to gain does. Do not ever let anyone guilt trip you into staying in a toxic environment just because you share a last name or a bloodline. Your peace of mind is your most valuable asset, and it is completely non-negotiable. My sister and her husband thought they could use my temporary weakness to bury me entirely. They thought they had backed me into a corner I could never escape. But they forgot that when you back a survivor into a dark corner, they do not just surrender. They adapt. They learn the layout of the dark, and they wait for the perfect moment to strike. I did not have to invent a weapon to destroy them. I simply took the exact same trap they laid out for me, and I locked them inside it. I want you to take a deep breath and look at your own life. Look at the people surrounding you. Are they feeding your flame, or are they constantly trying to blow it out? If you are surrounded by people who secretly pray for your downfall, it is time to build a new table. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to use your enemy's own trap to bury them? Have you ever had to walk away from the people you loved in order to finally save yourself? Go down into the comments below and let me know. Share your stories of survival, your moments of absolute clarity, and your triumphant returns. Your story might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to finally break their own chains today. If my journey resonated with you, if you felt that spark of recognition and empowerment, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. We are building a massive community here, a chosen family of survivors who refuse to apologize for their success and their boundaries. A rich, soulful melody begins to swell in the background. The music is triumphant and heavy with the rhythm of deep, undeniable resilience. It is the sound of a woman who walked through absolute hell and came out owning the entire underworld. I lean back into my velvet sofa, letting the warmth of the fire wash over my face. I offer you one final confident, unbreakable smile. The screen slowly fades to a deep, peaceful black.